Hello and welcome to another episode of Shattered Lives, a podcast for Reach Ireland. I'm Michael O'Toole and this is Paul Healy.
Hello, Michael.
How are you?
Not too bad. Yeah, now this is the 9th day of the Conor McGregor civil trial.
And I'm just going to read our usual caveats that this is a case involving, as Paul said, Conor McGregor and two other people. The complainant is a lady called Nikita Hand. The two respondents are Conor McGregor and James Lawrence. Nikita Hand alleges that both men raped her in a Dublin hotel in December 2018. Both men deny this allegation. Now, it's important, our usual caveat, that this is a civil case. There are no criminal proceedings or sanctions for anybody involved in this. It is day 9 of the case, and it's a significant day. The judge is Mr. Justice Alex Owens. The jury is 8 women and 4 men, and they are in court 24 of the 4 courts complex in central Dublin. So today, big day, Paul. We are coming to the end.
We are coming to the end. Yes, today was what is known as the closing speeches section of this trial, and indeed the charge by Judge Alexander Owens to the jury. And so what that means is that both the respondents and the complainant in this case, that their senior counsel make their final arguments, summing up, as you will, from their perspective of what the facts and the evidence is in the case.
Now, we were talking off air, but there was an interesting element to this. If anybody has been to the criminal courts, you'll see that the defence always speaks last and the prosecution, the person who takes the case, which is usually the state prosecutor, goes first. So the last word goes to the defence. Now, in this case, the respondents go first. Mr. Justice Owens, bit of relief for us because we're worried about a slip of the tongue. He calls them the defendants. We're going to keep calling them the respondents. But the respondents go first, and then the complainant, in other words, Miss Hand, her legal team, have the last say.
Yes. And in this case, so that means that Mr. Remy Farrell was the first to go. He is the senior counsel representing Conor McGregor in this case. And he spoke for a significant period of time, I think just under 2 hours. So we're going to try to give you as much as we can of what I heard and what my notes say. So you'll forgive me. It is quite detailed, but it gives you an overall sense of what their side of the case is. So Mr. Farrell, defending for Conor McGregor, said that this is a case about the evidence. He said, this is not a case about some kind of hot take. It's not about your gut. It's not about what colour writers in newspapers might say it's about, he said.
And you're not a colour writer, Paul?
I'm not, no. Didn't mention podcasts, in fairness. Okay. This case is about the evidence and nothing but the evidence. It's not about vindication. It's about those questions on the issue paper. So the issue paper was given to the jury. That is what is the issue, and they have to answer several questions in it when making their determination, when making their verdict at the end of this case. So Mr. Farrell said it seems a significant part of Nikita Hand's case is to suggest to you that the only form where she can get vindication is here in this case, because and with that, he said there's an implication that something went wrong when it came to the Director of Public Prosecution's decision not to prosecute. He said the judge will quite rightly tell you that it doesn't matter what the DPP thinks, and all that matters is that what you, the jury, think. That's all that matters in this case, and I'm inviting you to deal with this in what he said was a methodical and systematic way. He said to them, you do not give a verdict in accordance with your gut reaction, with your feelings, or that you might not like Mr. McGregor.
And Mr. Farrell then spoke about hearing an intake of breath coming from the jury box at a certain point in the civil case.
Yeah, well, just, he spoke about the fact that, many people in the jury may not like Conor McGregor, they may not love him, and that some of the things that Mr. McGregor may have said on the stand regarding when he referred to 2 lovely ladies, that the court did hear an intake of breath coming from the jury box. So he said, I'm simply asking you to interrogate your own views. Should it matter if Mr. McGregor is someone that you do or don't like? He said, I'm asking you to work your way methodically through the evidence. Look at the CCTV, work out the text messages, he said it's up to you, but you may consider it helpful and useful to cross-reference with those text messages and work out exactly what is happening at different points in time. He said the pieces of evidence do not lie, and they are silent witnesses. And he called on the jury to build up a framework to work out what is actually happening. He said there are bits of the case that cannot be contested, and he asked the jury to work out those bits that cannot be contested and see how everything else then slots into that. He said, I'm asking you that you can't ignore the who of this, but he said, I'm suggesting to you that you need to primarily look at the why, the when, and the what when asking yourself what is significant before you consider the who of it. He said that they need to consider, did Conor McGregor assault Nikita Hand? He said, in reality, this is about rape, and rape is a form of assault. But there's no doubt that whatever way you find this case, if you find for Mr. McGregor, that would be devastating for Miss Hand. And if you find for Miss Hand, that would be devastating for Mr. McGregor. And he was saying this in the context of, don't consider this case based on what way people are going to react or what way they might respond or what the implication of that may be. You are purely finding on the evidence and only the evidence in this case.
And I believe he also said it's not about speaking to the jury, who do I want to win this case or who do I not want to win this case? He said those are questions that you can't ask yourselves.
Yeah, and he said in that context what I'm saying, which is that this is about the evidence alone, and he complimented the jury and said, I suspect that you're probably going to be the hardest working jury because you're going to have to put those considerations out of your mind. You're not here to just decide what you would like the outcome to be. He said the next question you have to go about is discussing this in the jury room effectively. And he said you have to consider the fact that a jury is not a committee and that each of you has to be satisfied on your own on the balance of probability. So in this case, the jury do not have to find beyond all reasonable doubt. They have to find on the balance of probabilities. And Mr. Farrell was explaining exactly what that meant.
And just let me just pause there for a second. That is an important distinction. In the criminal case, as we've said before, it's beyond all reasonable doubt. So if you convict someone of a criminal charge, you have to be satisfied beyond all reasonable doubt. In the civil case, which this is, it's lower. And as Mr. Farrell said, it's the balance of probabilities.
Yeah, and he said, so it would be helpful maybe for the jury to ask himself the question when going through the evidence in the case, did such and such an event happen? And then answer with it probably did or it probably didn't. And he said that that is the standard. So on the basis of that, he said he was going to go forward and ask them questions and for them to ask themselves then whether it was probable that that happened or probable that it didn't. So he said the first question that he wants to ask the jury is in relation to what Mr. Gordon said all the way back on the very first day of this case. He said they were told that this case was, they were told by Miss Hand's side of things, Mr. John Gordon, that this case was very simple and that it was a single issue of rape and that after that there was a lot of what he described as noise surrounding it. He said, that's what you heard at the start of this case. And he said, you've since heard the evidence. So do you think that that's right, probable or not? He said, he's talking in his defense of Mr. McGregor about text messages and about the evidence of Danielle Keeley and James Lawrence. So Danielle Keeley was the other woman in the penthouse suite who was summoned to the trial and gave evidence. And James Lawrence is the other respondent in this case who was also alleged to have raped Miss Hand. Mr. Farrell said, what would this case be if the CCTV wasn't there? What view would you take of the case then? Would this likely be a civil case or would it much more likely be a criminal case considering a prosecution? He said, are those text messages just noise, as has been described by Miss Hand's team effectively?
And I think he made particular reference to the text in which she lied to her then partner, Steve.
Yeah, he brought this text message up a number of times, and we heard about it in the case. And he said he came back to it later, but he said, "Is that relevant from your perspective? And why is it that you're told to disregard that just as noise?" He says, is Danielle Keely just noise? The reason I put all that to you is the entirety of the approach of the plaintiff, Miss Hand, is very simple, that she was raped, she has the bruises to prove it, and that everything else after that is just a distraction, as he called it. He said it may be useful to say this, that over the last 20 or 30 years, that when the courts were dealing with cases like this, where you resolve issues where people say things happen or didn't happen in private, that one always has to figure out to identify what are called islands of facts. And he said that the islands of facts in this case are CCTV and text messages. And he said, build up a framework of what's not an issue to see what people are saying and whether that accords with that or not.
And I'm interested in this. He mentioned the doctrine in law of recent complaint. That's something I'd never heard of, I have to say.
Yes, he brought that up and said that courts and juries are allowed to take account of how a person presents and what they say. So he said if someone presents in a distressed state immediately after rape, that is consistent perhaps with the account that they're giving. He said in this case, you have quite a bit of evidence in relation to the plaintiff, but he said there is a slight problem when it comes to her account, in that the jury in this case are in a privileged position, as he called it, in that they can actually observe Nikita Hand on the CCTV footage. He said that footage, it's not just in the immediate aftermath of what she's alleged to have happened, the rape in the Beacon Hotel, but it's for hours, several hours afterwards. And he said those are all things that you're going to have to consider as well. He said the CCTV footage from immediately after the events that Miss Hand describes, and it's also in the duration of what she's alleged as well. And he said, which is more indicative of what she's said to have occurred, basically? Is it the account that they're giving and what they can see with their own eyes in the CCTV, or is it what Miss Hand has alleged?
And Mr. Farrell then brought up the evidence of a witness, Emer Brennan.
Yeah, so people might remember that Nikita Hand's evidence was that she went to her friend Emer Brennan after the events in the Beacon Hotel, and that she spoke to Emer Brennan. She was the first person she spoke to about the alleged assault. And Mr. Farrell said that the significance of Miss Brennan's evidence is underpinned by her own understanding of its importance, in that she kept a record. So we heard that she wrote down only like 2 weeks after the events her memory of what Miss Hand had said to her. And Mr. Farrell said that Miss Hand that Miss Brennan said Miss Hand told her she woke up, that she saw 2 security guards present in the room, and that she thought she was going to be gang raped. He said that we know from Nikita Hand's own account that she gave in her evidence that could never have happened. So he said what the jury have to do is contrast that with the evidence that Miss Hand has given of waking up in the bed next to Conor McGregor and remembering nothing. He said, how can those two things be true? So the allegation that she gave to Miss Brennan that she woke up, ran out of the room because she thought she was going to be gang raped, or the account that she had given on the stand and elsewhere that she had woken up and couldn't remember what had happened to her. He said that also Miss Hand had told Emer Brennan that she looked for Danielle Keely and that Danielle wasn't there. He said it's quite apparent from Nikita Hand's evidence that she sought to, quote, airbrush Danielle Keely out of her evidence. He also said that Nikita declined to name Danielle Keely when she was in the rotunda, when she spoke to Gardaí. And he said that in Emer Brennan's house, Miss Hand had not been in contact with Danielle Keely at that point. She does not know if the account is correct, whether Danielle heard or perceived anything that might be consistent with rape. So he asked, what is it at that stage that Miss Hand knows that perhaps might make her reluctant to put Danielle Keely in the middle of her case? He said, how could she have known in the early hours of the morning, or whatever time it was, that Danielle Keely wasn't going to back her up? So Mr. Farrell is saying that by her own account to Miss Brennan, Miss Hand said that she was jumping up awake, thinking that she was going to be gang raped. So he says, if Danielle is there, then surely she would have said something to Danielle. And these are two things that just couldn't have happened, these two different accounts. He said, we know for a matter of fact that there's no suggestion that when she spoke to Emer Brennan of a blackout, of memory loss. And interestingly, rather than accepting Danielle was there, she said that James Lawrence was there in the room and that she had reported the rape to James Lawrence at that point. She had claimed to Miss Brennan that she left immediately, that the driver asked her had Conor wanted her to leave, and she said yes. He said he wanted the jury to pause and think about that. He says, we know she didn't want to go home. So again, is there some sort of confusion on Nikita Hand's part in giving her account from start to finish? She had said she ran off. She ended up getting into a hotel. She got into a taxi. So again, he asked, is Miss Hand giving an actual account of the events because she had no memory of coming or going, of waking up but not remembering things? She knew how she left, but not where she went. And he said he wanted them to bear in mind all of this evidence. He also said that when Nikita Hand was cross-examined on this, that she must have been confused. That was her explanation, that she, when this evidence was put to her, that she must have been confused. And he said that's one explanation, but there are others.
And Mr. Farrell said she told her series of things that, and he says, that never actually happened.
Yeah, so he put it to the jury that the events that Miss Hand describes had never actually happened. And that when she was challenged on this in the witness box, she said that the main details of her story were there, even when she spoke to Emer Brennan in the hours of after the alleged rape. She had said in her cross-examination that she couldn't remember and that she was confused when it came to certain factors. So Mr. Farrell said, we're going back to answering the question of probably or probably not. He said, ask yourself, is that confusion by Nikita Hand, or is it just pure fantasy? He said then he wanted to point them to CCTV footage, 45-minute CCTV footage from the Beacon Hotel, which we saw. And he wanted them to specifically look at minute 41:53 to see that the security guard at that point had gone home. So he asked them, how does that fit in with what Nikita Hand was claiming in relation to her account that she had an interaction with the security guard at that point? He said also when she gives her account to her partner, Steve, again, there's no suggestion of memory loss. Steve was not called, nor was the recording played as part of her own case. The recording was ultimately played as part of the respondent's case. He said, you may want to put all of that on the scales when considering the consistency of Nikita Hand's account. He said these were the first two people, so Emer Brennan and Steve, her partner, were the first people that Nikita Hand made her reports of the alleged rape to. He said you might want to consider the sheer number of lies that she told to them. You might want to count them, he said, and note how persistent those lies were. The first lie was what she said, her claim that she went into town. And he said, we know that that's not true.
And listeners may remember during the trial, she was challenged about lying to her boyfriend, and she said that's not a crime to lie to her boyfriend. And Mr. Farrell brought that up today again.
Yeah, and he said, people do lie from time to time, but what he was suggesting is much more interesting, is why someone tells a lie. So he said, you must ask yourself the question of why a person is telling a particular lie. So he said, why did she lie to Steve? Is it perhaps because she's going into town? Is it because going into town is one thing, but going to a hotel in Sandyford with two men is quite another thing? He said the next lie that Nikita Hand tells is she tells her boyfriend, Steve, that Danielle, Jade, and everyone else from work are there in the penthouse with her. He said, why does she say that they were in the Morgan bar? Why is she putting all of those people with her in a bar? She then goes on multiple occasions to tell her boyfriend, Steve, in this recording that we heard, that he, aka Conor McGregor, would kill her. He said that that's an allegation we don't see popping up ever again. So speaking to the Gardaí or in any other claim. He said, interestingly, Nikita Hand tells her boyfriend Steve in this recording that she ran out of the place. He said that's an echo of the untruth that she told Emer Brennan, something that we now know to be completely untrue, he said. He said throughout this recording that Nikita Hand is aware that she's telling lies. She cries but insists she's not lying. She's able to even recall some text she'd sent earlier that stage asking if she could go out with the girls. She's referencing the only truthful text for the purpose of convincing her boyfriend Steve that she isn't lying again. And Mr. Farrell said again, there's no suggestion in any of this recording of memory loss from Nikita Hand. So when considering the question of consistency, he said you might want to pay some attention to the very first two people that Nikita Hand made this rape allegation to on the night of the 9th into the early hours of the 10th of December.
So I think next, Paul, Mr. Farrell references the Octagon quote.
Yeah, so people may recall, if you're following the evidence of this case, that Miss Hand alleges that when she was being raped and put in a chokehold by Conor McGregor, that he had said, "Now you know what it feels like to when I was in the octagon and tapped out 3 times." Mr. Farrell said that this suggestion is a detail. If they take the suggestion that this is a detail that Miss Hand could not just come up with herself in passing, she never mentioned a trip to Las Vegas. So this suggestion that she knew nothing about MMA. He's asking them just to think about that there was a fight on in Vegas at the time. He said the next information point we have is a text message that Nikita Hand sent to her friend Jen at 23:09 on the night of the alleged rape, and she felt like something had happened, and he said it's at this point that she seems to have gone from happy, having fun, to apparently being distressed. And he asked the jury to consider, how does that figure with the consistency of Miss Hand's story? He said happy, happy, happy all the way through, then bang, as soon as she knows she has to go home and face the music, as he put it. He said you can't ignore that time.
And I think then, Paul, Mr. Farrell brings up the Morgan Hotel again.
Yeah, and he asked the jury to draw up a pros and cons list in relation to this. He said on the pro side, she knew it was the Beacon Hotel. He said you could hear from her evidence that she was curious to know where she was going when she was being driven around in the car by Conor McGregor and his driver. We heard in the evidence that it was broad daylight when they were driving around. He said this was not someone being driven around in the back of a van. And he said, as ordinary people with common sense, you can safely assume that people know the difference between Sandyford, where the Beacon Hotel is based, and Temple Bar, where the Morgan Hotel is based. And he said it is a fairly stark difference. He said, think about the lie that she told her boyfriend Steve there. How could anyone conceivably mix up the Morgan Hotel in Sandyford, the Morgan Hotel in Temple Bar, and the Beacon, and the Beacon Hotel in Sandyford?
And he says that the Beacon is very much not Temple Bar.
Yeah, and he said, by the basis of her own evidence, if she was curious as to where she was going, he said it's remarkable that she never once looked out of the window of the hotel that she was in at any stage. He said that we can see from the CCTV footage that she made a visit to reception, but she deals with that by saying she couldn't remember. He said, what does Miss Hand point to establish that she thought she was in the Morgan Hotel? And he says literally the sole thing was the bathtub. He says they have to consider that. Is it probable that she knew she was in the Beacon Hotel? Did she lie to her partner Stephen about that? But perhaps most importantly, he said to the jury, did she lie to you about that? Probably or not.
And then I believe, Paul, Mr. Farrell raises the issue of the CCTV.
Yeah, he asked, was it because Nikita Hand was concerned from the CCTV in the Beacon Hotel that it might not back up her story a little bit like Danielle Keeley? He said, again, I suggest to you that this question is not a difficult one. I suggest to you that you can't take the view other than Miss Hand knew exactly where she was. He asked the jury, did Nikita Hand have sex with James Lawrence? This is a question they have to ask themselves. He said she was alone for several hours with Mr. Lawrence. She left the hotel with him. Mr. Lawrence says they had sex. He said CCTV shows much affection between the two of them. Now, he said, imagine if you're one of the people who got into the lift and saw this. Would you have asked yourselves that they should get a room? He told the jury, look at the CCTV. Ask yourself that question. What does Miss Hand say about what happened? She says that is something she wouldn't do. She said that she didn't find James Lawrence attractive and that she was on her period at the time and that she had a tampon inside of her. He said, what does the CCTV say about all three of those propositions? He said that the CCTV shows that Nikita Hand clearly found James Lawrence irresistible. She self-evidently found Mr. Lawrence very attractive, and you can see that on the CCTV, he said. Try and figure out which one is more eager when you look at the CCTV. Who's chasing who? Then he said on the issue of the tampon, he said one thing that's clear from the CCTV is that Nikita Hand is not showing any form of discomfort of any sort. He said contrast that with the footage that we see from the ambulance the next day. He said, consider all of that and look at this question. He said they also have to give consideration for the fact that what Miss Hand said about Mr. Lawrence and the suggestion that he is a patsy or a fall guy in this case. He said, on the contrary, you'll find that Miss Hand is saying in her case that she was raped by James Lawrence. He said, now you may well be scratching your heads about this, because when it comes to this court case, she said that she believed that she didn't ever have sex with James Lawrence. And he said that that is an extraordinary situation, because he said Miss Hand is apparently prepared to sue someone for rape in circumstances where she doesn't think that she had sex with him, and she never thought she had sex with him. He said on multiple occasions, she said, I seen a drunken, vulnerable woman on CCTV. So he said, when you look at the CCTV, what do you see? Do you see someone who knows what she wants? Do you see someone, when you look at the evidence, who's well able to lie?
And then again, Mr. Farrell refers to the text messages.
Yes, so there's a text that she sent to her boyfriend Steve about staying out, and he said, we now know that everyone else had gone home, that they weren't going out. So he said the jury need to ask themselves, why is this lie being told to Steve? Steve texts back again and asked where she's going, and she told the lie that they were going to the goat. He says, why is she telling that lie? Why is she telling lies before she's even met Mr. McGregor? He said that Miss Hand gave a very vivid account about what allegedly had happened when she sent this particular central text that is probably the central issue when it comes to text, this text message that she sent to Steve at 6:28 p.m. So he said that this is perhaps the most important lie in this entire case. He said that Nikita Hand gave the jury a very vivid account, that she woke up in a panic, that she went to her phone and she was worried about what time it was. She got the phone out of the bag and she wanted to reassure Steve and sent him a text message that she was having a great time. So Mr. Farrell was asking why she told this lie and why she told Gardaí this account, and that when we looked at the CCTV in this case, that everything she said is flatly and entirely contradicted. He said, you may well come to the view that she spends an awful lot of time on her phone that can't be accounted for. And he said, what else is Miss Hand doing during this period? It's a notable feature of that sequence of events that the last thing she does, he said, was send a text message to her partner, Steve. He said, it's striking that she seems to think it's important to call Conor McGregor before she gets back to her boyfriend, Steve. And he says, you can look at that on the CCTV. She finishes up her business on the phone and is seen doing what he called a little victory dance before she goes up back to the room with James Lawrence.
And Mr. Farrell said that Miss Hand said she was panicked and worried about her partner, but he says that you should bear in mind the footage when you think of that.
Yeah, well, he said, look, you need to consider whether any of this is true, what Nikita Hand is saying. He said, we know that it's not true that her claim of going to the bag and picking out the phone and being in the bedroom with Conor McGregor when she sent that text message, because we can see from the CCTV that she was actually in the underground car park. So he said all that texture and detail of waking up and panicking and worrying about Steve, that just didn't happen. And he said you can actually see where she is. And he said the question is, did she lie about it? Did she lie about where she was, what she was doing, and why she sent the text? He said, look at the footage. You can see, can you sense any sense of concern out of Miss Hand at this point in the footage? And can you figure out why it is that she's calling Conor McGregor before her boyfriend, and why she's texting her friend Jen before texting her boyfriend? And he asked the jury to consider, did she lie to you? Probably or probably not. Coming back to that question of they have to find probable or probable not.
And Mr. Farrell also asked the jury to consider why Danielle Keeley wasn't called as a witness by the complainant or the plaintiff.
Yeah, and in bringing that up, he said that when Miss Keeley gave her evidence, she agreed all the way back in 2019 with Gardaí that the doors in the connecting doors in the penthouse suite between the bedroom and the living room were not fully shut. And Mr. Farrell said that this is an important data point in this case. He said, in this case, Miss Hand has accepted now in cross-examination that she didn't know whether or not the door was closed, but she had told Gardaí that she believed that the door was locked. He said that this is an important piece of evidence. He also said that if Miss Hand's version of events is correct, that Danielle Keeley was last seen getting into a car with a violent rapist, according to Miss Hand. Yet he said she attempts to write Danielle Keeley in her account out. He asks, why does Miss Hand decline to name Miss Keeley to Gardaí the next day? And he said, you may consider it curious that she had to be summoned in this case. And he said it's notable that when Mr. Gordon from Miss Hand ultimately cross-examined Miss Keeley, he wanted to gently suggest that she had been not that Mr. Gordon had wanted to gently suggest to Miss Keeley that she had been nobbled, and perhaps to suggest to the jury that Miss Keeley had in some way been part of a conspiracy and been scared off in giving her evidence. He said to the jury, Mr. Farrell, that is, that the evidence that you have from Miss Keeley arose from circumstances that it's fair to say that she wasn't hugely enthused to be in the courtroom. He said, but she did confirm that Miss Hand was in and out of the bedroom, and as far as she was concerned, she saw no signs of distress.
And Mr. Farrell says, how can that conceivably be reconciled with Miss Hand's account of what happened?
Yeah, he said Miss Keeley told the court that Miss Hand clearly wanted to stay in the Beacon Hotel. And he said, ask yourself then, is all of that just noise? He then moved on to the photographs of the bruises, and he asked why they were initially deleted. He said it appears from Miss Hand's account that she became concerned about bruises and that she had to come home and face the music, as he put it, and how was she going to explain them to Steve? He said, you may recall in cross-examination that Miss Hand, when she made a statement to Gardaí, couldn't remember wearing a watch or not. And he said that this is an account that she never gave to Gardaí, and it's simply a detail latched on. He said in relation to deleted text messages, he said the explanation that Miss Hand has given to the court is she didn't want to press charges. And he asked them, is that an excuse that stands up to any degree of scrutiny? Why the need to go around deleting text messages, and what do you think about that? He asked the jury. He asked them to consider, is it just a coincidence that these text messages do not remain available? And it's curious that certain ones were not deleted, text messages to her boyfriend, for example, and look at the time that it has taken Miss Hand on the phone, and that only 2 text messages from that time period in the evening survive. He asked the jury to consider why we only have those text messages and 1 phone call to Conor McGregor. And he said it was very curious. And he says, we don't know what happened to the rest.
Okay, Paul. So I think Mr. Farrell then, the next thing he brought up was Miss Hand's alleged memory loss.
Yeah, and he reminded the jury that on the second day of the case, Nikita Hand had said that certain things she could remember and certain things are just gone. He said that's something of an understatement. He said that the jury might have got excited when a psychiatrist, Dr. Leader, came to the stand, and that she might have maybe been able to explain some mechanism via the PTSD as to why Nikita Hand had memory loss, but she didn't. He said, we know that Nikita Hand did go out from time to time, and it's not for the first time that she went out and had a heavy night, but she had no prior history of blackouts or memory loss. So he in pointing to this, he pointed to the evidence of Mr. Gordon talking about delayed shock in this case. And he said the idea of delayed shock is put before you to suggest that someone who's carrying on normally, appears to be happy, is actually in shock. He said this is the way that they explain that it goes on for several hours where Miss Hand appears to be happy. Now, he said, is that really a real explanation? He said that she remembers being raped, but then she briefly unremembers the rape when she woke up some time later. She thought she was going to die. She said she was choked 3 times, but then all her faculties go out the window temporarily. She wakes up. She remembers going into Danielle. She remembers sending the text message to Steve, but she doesn't remember that she was actually in the basement. She remembers going down to say goodbye to Mr. McGregor, but she doesn't remember asking him to stay. She remembers nothing, he said, of significant periods of time afterwards, but she remembers being back up in the room and then all of a sudden recalling the rape. But she doesn't recall what happened after, he said. She remembers waking up in the taxi, but not remembering having got the taxi with James Lawrence. She remembers going to Emer Brennan, but she doesn't remember exactly what she told her. He asked the jury, is it probably true that she doesn't remember all of this stuff, or is she avoiding it? Anything problematic by saying that she can't remember any of that? Sorry. Mr. Farrell said he was going to suggest to the jury that Nikita Hand was giving a carefully curated account, that she knew it became necessary to pretend that she couldn't remember the fact of the rape when she woke up. He said she knew full well of the fact that she had had sex with James Lawrence after. She knew full well that the fact she had sex with James Lawrence was fatal to the account that she had given. She knew she had to account for some of the texts, and she must have been acutely aware of the text at 18:28 and how it looked. He put it to the jury that this is a very carefully put together account. So he asked the jury, is it probable or improbable that someone who remembers being raped doesn't remember the facts around it that don't corroborate it? He said if it was anyone other than Mr. McGregor, this was the final thing that he said to the jury, if this was anyone other than Conor McGregor, would the door in the jury room even hit you in the backside before you were back out to dismiss this case? And that concluded Remy Farrell.
And so I think that, just reading your text today, Paul, your tweets, that was about 2 hours that Mr. Farrell spoke for.
Yes, and I feel like I've been talking for 2 hours myself.
Okay, so
keep on trucking here. Let's go.
So there was a short break, and then John Fitzgerald, senior counsel, who is representing James Lawrence, who's the other respondent in this case, gave his own closing speech.
Yeah, and he said that James Lawrence, look, he arrives here with none of the fame or even perhaps notoriety of Conor McGregor. He's 35 odd years living in relative obscurity. And the great thing he says about this system is that you're treated absolutely equally. He said that James Lawrence and Conor McGregor come before you to be tried, not because of who they are. And he said that you have to decide this case based on the evidence. Now, he said he was adopting some of the positions of Mr. Farrell, but he said in his own client's defense. So Mr. Fitzgerald said there is a highly unusual factor in this case, in that bizarrely, in order to find for James Lawrence, you have to say that the other side are saying, we want you to believe part of what James Lawrence is saying, but not the rest. That they want the jury to believe that he had sex with Miss Hand, but they then want them to disbelieve that she consented to that, or that she was in any position to consent. So he said that Miss Hand effectively would have been lying then on this central issue of whether or not James Lawrence had had sex with her. He said, more surprisingly, still, she said she never believed that he had sex with her. She always believed that this was a made-up story. Now, he said that that is an extraordinary situation because Mr. Lawrence and indeed many other people will be scratching their heads and saying, you do have to wonder why he is here at all. He said the questions also raised about James Lawrence being some form of a patsy. He said you have to think about all the circumstances. And that one thing all sides agree on is that there was a media stir about this. And he said you have to ask the mindset of someone who is going to step into that and make up a story to put themselves into that, and also the possibility of being convicted. He said, who does that? Who would make up a story to put themselves into the frame? And if you break it down to say that this was a made-up story, if you accept Miss Hand's conspiracy theory that this story was made 2 to 3 days after, then you have to consider a number of things. So he said that Mr. Lawrence was giving his account before he knew what evidence there was out there. At the time he went to his solicitor's office, the CCTV was still being harvested. So he said you must imagine the immense relief for Mr. Lawrence when he eventually saw that footage and he found out that it bore every aspect of his story. He said his client was even luckier still because he couldn't have known that the woman he first met of the 9th of December, Danielle Keeley, was also going to support his version of events in important aspects. It was a hell of a risk to take, he said, and it's a risk that nobody in their right mind would take.
And he also, Mr. Fitzgerald also says that Miss Hand gave a fairly graphic and detailed account of sex, which he alleges was rape.
She characterised what happened between her and Conor McGregor as rape, he said, and she didn't think it was long after they arrived at the hotel when she then fell asleep afterwards. So Mr. Fitzgerald was saying if Miss Hand's account is to be believed, and there's a significant period of time that she was asleep, having not taken further drugs or alcohol, but she remembered waking up in a panic. Now, he said she gets that wrong because she is actually down in the basement when she sent this text message when she woke up in a panic. She remembers going down and up in a lift with James Lawrence, and then a second period of time where she blacked out in a period of not remembering. Mr. Fitzgerald said it seems like these things, she had said that it seemed like these things were coming back to her, and that there was then a full memory of the horror of the events up in the room. Mr. Fitzgerald said whatever Miss Hand's state of mind, it was a very specific memory after a period of not remembering, followed by another period of not remembering when she gets into a taxi and goes home. He said that I have to say that it's worth pausing at this point and asking, is that a plausible version of events? He said the evidence of her account is that she was violently raped, she fell asleep with her rapist. When she woke up, everyone was trying to leave, and that she wanted everyone to stay. Then at some point, the events came back to her in its entirety. He said that Mr. Lawrence on her account is sympathetic, but rather than report it or do anything about it, they went and had a burger and chips together. And he said, I have to say to you that that seems rather bizarre. So Mr. Fitzgerald said that by Nikita Hand's own account, she became upset briefly. By Mr. Lawrence's account, Miss Hand became upset briefly, but then cheered up, and they left the hotel together. Now, he said that that is an account that is consistent with the account given all along, and it is consistent with what he said was in the CCTV. He said that the jury have to take an overall view of the CCTV, and he said, all I would ask you to do is view it slowly and take an overall view. But the two questions I would ask you to consider are, firstly, does it bear out her evidence to the court that she wasn't attracted to James Lawrence and that she was really, really drunk and she didn't know what she was doing? He said that when you look at the CCTV, Miss Hand had said she's a very vulnerable woman, and she had said, I don't feel like I'm wrong because I don't remember any of it. He said the jury have to ask themselves, is that a real answer? He said, I suggest to you that when you look at the footage, what you see is the opposite of a very drunk woman. There is a lot of showing her functioning, talking to James Lawrence, interaction between them, and also tellingly with other people.
And Mr. Fitzgerald says that, this happened in a public area of the hotel and nobody reacted.
Yeah, he said there isn't even a second glance. Nikita Hand was seen pressing buttons in a lift. At one stage, she pushes Mr. Lawrence away from the button, and she slaps his hand away and presses it herself. He asked the question, is this someone with no agency and no control? Someone who lies to her boyfriend and inquires about the whereabouts of another friend. Does someone like that, is she well able to think through the consequences of her actions? He said on Miss Hand's case about the injuries she has, is she ascribing them to James Lawrence? He said it's very difficult to see how any of her evidence of the bruising can be ascribed to James Lawrence. I really don't know how you can begin to process the bruising, is what he said. He said that in the evidence of Danielle Keeley, who was described him as Miss Hand as a friend, Miss Hand had said she was not known to Mr. Lawrence. And he said that while we may disagree on some versions of the events, he would suggest that Miss Keeley's evidence effectively backs up James Lawrence's evidence on some key points.
Namely, that she didn't appear distressed.
That she did not appear distressed, yes. He said, in all the circumstances, this is a bizarre case against James Lawrence, and to find against him, you have to carve out certain parts of the story and disregard the rest. He said, you have to disregard the CCTV, which he said was entirely consistent with James Lawrence's account.
Okay, Paul, so I think that was the end of Mr. Fitzgerald's closing speech.
Yes, we then broke for lunch, and when we came back, we had the closing speech of the complainants, the complainant in this case, Nikita Hand, and her counsel, Mr. John Gordon, senior counsel.
Okay, and how long did he speak for, just before we get into it? Was it a long speech?
He spoke for an even longer period of time, but we're going to just give you as much of the main points as we can. Now, he said to the court that we heard an awful lot of evidence and some anger and some vitriol in this case. He said that Remy Farrell sadly makes a virtue out of the CCTV. But in that context, something Mr. Fitzgerald said before lunch struck him. He said, kind of a throwaway line, that he mentioned the fact that other people around the hotel didn't seem to have any issue with what they saw. Now, he said that none of the hotel workers were actually called as witnesses in this case, and that only one member of Conor McGregor's security team was. He said, of course, the cameras don't lie, but they don't always tell you the whole story either. He said, in relation to Mr. Farrell's talk about islands in this case, he said that there is a rock in this case, and both of his friends, Mr. Farrell and Mr. Fitzgerald, sail around that rock quite delicately. He said, I would suggest to you use your own common sense. It would appear that this lady in the CCTV is not in any good shape. There is a rock in this case that both my friends sail around delicately, that my client was beaten up and badly beaten up. He said the best that Mr. Farrell could come up with is to suggest that the inconsistency and lies with Miss Hand's account, the inconsistency and lies to her partner. He said initially Conor McGregor seemed to be making the case that this was just fun, athletic sex, but over the course of his evidence to the court in the witness stand, he changed his story. His evidence, and he said it more than once, was that there was no tampon. And Mr. Gordon said there was even an intrepid possibility of a third man from Mr. McGregor's evidence. He said Mr. McGregor, understandably, obviously thought, as the case approached, that there was going to be a problem over the tampon and the severity of the injuries. He said that Miss Hand's interview with Gardaí, she had said that she became aware for the first time about the claim that James Lawrence had had sex with her. In the meantime, Conor McGregor had interviews with Gardaí on the 17th of January, and during that period, CCTV and the injuries were put to him, and he made a short statement. And he ultimately made another statement in which he expressed his shock over those injuries. Now, Mr. Gordon said that is for the first point in time that Mr. McGregor had to face up to what he'd done, because he did it, he said, and what he did was savage.
And then Mr. Gordon brings up the evidence of Ethna Scully, a paramedic.
Yes, and he said, remember Ethna Scully, she is the lady who drove the ambulance, and she described to the court how this was one of the worst cases that she'd ever seen. He said, then think of the evidence of Dr. Kane in the Rotunda Hospital, and he had also stated this was one of the worst cases he'd ever seen. So Mr. Gordon said, let's put it this way, somebody did this to Miss Hand, and it happened in the Beacon Hotel, and he said it was Mr. McGregor. In the course of his evidence the other day, he said, you will have noticed the mask slipped. Conor McGregor lost his temper, he said. And what did we witness? You witnessed it. A stream of invective aimed directly at my client across the courtroom. I bring you back to my client's account of what happened. As I said, opening the case, she's no angel. She was out for a good time, and indeed, up to a certain point, she had a great time. But he said things then went badly wrong. So he said, having gone to the hotel with Conor McGregor and his friends, she foolishly, perhaps, he said, advised him that she didn't want to have sex with him. She said, first of all, that she had a bit of a family connection here, and she mentioned Dee Devlin. She mentioned that she had a tampon in, and she explained that she could not have sex with the tampon in. Mr. Gordon said, on the balance of probabilities, it's up for the jury to decide. But she said that Conor McGregor wouldn't take no for an answer. He got her into the hotel, had laid his plans for having sex, and had earlier laid his plans for having sex when he was in the nightclub, and asked his driver to book the hotel room. He said that at that stage he was in Crystal nightclub with two girls. The girls decided to go home. He drove one of them to Clontarf. So he had the suite booked, but there were no girls. He said, so that is why Nikita said in the course of her evidence that she was surprised to ultimately hear from Conor McGregor so late in the evening. Mr. Gordon described Nikita Hand as the substitute. He said, when you look at the manner in which this was put together, a reasonable inference is that Mr. McGregor's intention to have sex and his protestations about sometimes staying overnight is risible nonsense. He said that Conor McGregor started his evidence by saying that he had left that day to go to his own gym in Dublin, and he ended it by saying that he was going to use the gym in the hotel, and that's why he had the room. Mr. Gordon said that that is absolute poppycock, and it should be treated as the nonsense that it is. He said that Conor McGregor now decides that he should drop more possibilities into the equation when he was on the witness stand, possibilities that he said he kept to himself until he was in the court. Those possibilities included the claim that Nikita Hand swan dived into the bath. And Mr. Gordon said, really, in relation to that? She was out for 3 days as she probably got knocked about. And again, he asked the jury, really? He said, thank goodness you have the common sense to realize that you are being sold a pup by this arrogant man, describing Conor McGregor. He said, you really have to bear in mind that the islands are on this side of the court and that Mr. McGregor, far from dealing with it, in fact, has run away from it.
And he describes Mr. McGregor, he uses the words appalling behaviour.
Yeah, he said there is no answer to his appalling behaviour, but bear in mind that there's not just these basic facts, but there is also a litany of corroborative evidence, a litany of professional evidence, he said in this case, all of which confirms his client's story and confirms what happened to her. He mentioned the evidence of Dr. Kane, of Dr. Clark, her GP, as eloquent a doctor as I have ever heard in court. He said there's no doubt that this girl suffered PTSD and no doubt she has ongoing triggers. Then, of course, you had the evidence of Dr. Leader, one of the country's most prominent psychologists, he said. And she told you that this lady had suffered PTSD. And what causes PTSD? A violent assault. And he said this has not been challenged in this case.
And he also says that the defendants did not call a psychiatrist when they could have.
Yeah, he said Mr. McGregor's side and Mr. Lawrence's side could have called a psychiatrist, but they didn't. And he said, I suggest the only reason they did this is because any professional people would agree with my professional people. So here you have it, the evidence that she was assaulted. So he said, I'm not going to be as long as Mr. Farrell. In fact, he was longer. The facts are straightforward, simple, and incontrovertible. He said their case is building on trying to throw as much dust in your eyes as possible. He said, we know that Mr. Lawrence came forward after Conor McGregor's interview with the guards. He said, you know from his evidence that he went to solicitors within 2 or 3 days. We know he went to the same solicitor as Mr. McGregor, who paid all of his legal fees. So he said, we may assume that Mr. Lawrence was in cahoots with Mr. McGregor from the word go. Even though he went to solicitors, he didn't actually turn up with what he said was his little statement until the 18th of January. It was at this point that he drops in what he described as the little hand grenade that he had sex with my client. He describes it as soft sex in his statement. Why would he describe it as soft, he said? He threw it in because he'd seen the evidence that this lady had been beaten up at this stage. He said you throw it in not only to distance yourself, but to confuse the narrative and to make her out to be an even bigger hussy. It's quite clear again, using common sense, that these two chaps have been in collusion throughout, and they're continuing to be in collusion to give you the impression that my client in some way was completely unaffected by her encounter with Mr. McGregor, and that therefore nothing really happened. He said again, that flies in the face of the rock of what actually happened. He said, notice that Mr. Lawrence seems to have been bought into this idea by Mr. McGregor that there was no tampon. He'd said on the stand, he made it a big issue in his evidence. He made it a cornerstone of his evidence. Evidence never put to my client by Mr. Farrell, and he stated that this, what we heard in court from Mr. Lawrence and Mr. McGregor on the stand, was a whole new set of evidence, a whole new story.
And then we know that Mr. McGregor said in his evidence that Miss Hand was telling lies, and Mr. Gordon basically says that the liar here is not his client, but is Mr. McGregor.
Yeah, he said, rather than repetitiously calling my client a liar, the liar here is Mr. McGregor, who doesn't have the courage, doesn't have the decency to own up to what he did. He said, this is a man who thrives by the media. If he was a man at all, he'd apologise to my client for what he did to her that night. But he's not a man. He's a coward, a devious coward, and you should treat him for what he is. He then turned the jury's attention to a photograph of the scratch on Miss Hand's breast. And he said, my client gave her evidence as to what happened, she put her hands in front of her to keep him off her, and then he pressed down on top of her and her watch scratched her breast. He said, I'd suggest to you that the only possible method of this happening is what she described. He said it is a talisman in this case. It's one of the little islands of facts that is indisputable. And he says it corroborates my client's account of exactly how the encounter took place. He said there is plenty of corroborative evidence in this case that corroborates Miss Hand's story. When it comes to the quote of Mr. McGregor allegedly saying that she now knew what it felt like to when he was in the octagon and he tapped out three times. He said that Mr. McGregor had 2 months earlier been in Las Vegas and had been beaten in a big match. How was he beaten? His opponent put him in a stranglehold and he had to tap out. Tap out being what a fighter has to do if they surrender and lose the match, which he did. So he said to the jury, you can imagine what was going through Mr. McGregor's mind. He was in some temper and he was looking to take it out on my client come hell or high water. The idea that she went off and made this story up within a couple of hours, he said, is frankly preposterous. She mentioned it to her friend Emer Brennan. Of course, her account, he said, is all over the place, but she is suffering from a fragmented memory at this point. And he said, how would you feel if someone had done this to you? Would you be cool, calm, collected? You know you'd be in a terrible state. And she was in a terrible state. But he says this is the moment that happened to her that stays embedded in her memory for the rest of her days.
So, and then he says, where do we need to go from here? He says, I don't believe we need to go any further.
Yeah, he said that Miss And, she had originally stated she didn't want to press charges and that all she wanted at the point in time on the morning of the 10th was to get the tampon out of her. But he said the matter ultimately went beyond her because she was in the rotunda and Gardaí automatically got involved, whether she'd like it or not. He said the criticism was somewhat tongue-in-cheek that her client deleted the material off her phone. He said she did this because she was frightened. That's why she was deleting the material. He said, why in goodness name did she ask Emer to delete those photos? Only one rational explanation. She was terrified out of her wits. He said, and she decided to try and forget about the whole thing. Only she couldn't because Gardaí were involved. And what did she do then? She gave them her phone, she assisted them, and she did everything she could to assist, even though she was frightened. He said, whatever you might think about his client's social habits, one thing you know is that she has courage, and she had the courage to see this through. She said she was bitterly disappointed when the DPP decided not to prosecute Conor McGregor, but she makes no criticism of the DPP. And it wasn't until after all of that criminal investigation ended that in 2020 she finally instructed her solicitors to take the steps that have led to the civil case today. And he said that this remains the only avenue for Miss Hand for vindication.
And he also says that Mr. Farrell says this is not about vindication, only compensation, and he says that's wrong.
Yeah, he said the jury are, he should take into account that a person is absolutely entitled to seek compensation. And this happens in other cases, for example, medical negligence cases. And people who have been wronged can ultimately go through this process to find that they were wronged. And he said that in this case, if anybody needs to be vindicated, it is my client. The abuse didn't just happen in the hotel, he said. It didn't just happen during the Garda investigation. It continued in the hearing of this case when you were subjected to arrogant, distasteful, dishonest testimony from the defendant. He said the abuse hasn't ended. It is continuing.
And Mr. Gordon then says how the respondents state this case was taken in what he said was bad faith and it was tantamount to an attempt at extortion.
Yes, this is what he's saying, the other side are saying. And he said, look, you've heard the evidence about her earnings, her attempts to go back to work, the triggers that she suffered. You heard no evidence from the other side that contravenes any of that. He said the jury is entitled to accept the evidence in terms of loss of earnings, and they should take into account that Miss Hand no longer lives in the area of Drimna and that she now lives in fear. He says you're entitled to assess the fact that she wants to get away from him, Conor McGregor. She needs to get away from him. He said that she will always be a marked woman because she stood up to Conor McGregor. You heard about the fear she expressed to the guards. It comes up in the evidence of Dr. Kane, he said, as well, and the evidence of Dr. Leader and Dr. Clark. He said there is no magic wand in this case and that seeking vindication is, of course, a huge step, but it doesn't change what happened and it doesn't change the fact that she will live in fear for the rest of her days. And he mentioned then that she was a marked woman because she stood up to Mr. McGregor.
So then Mr. Gordon brings up the issue of damages and says there are 4 categories.
Yeah, now he went on about this at some length and referred to evidence of certain witnesses. That I don't propose to go into all of that because it's quite detailed. But there are 4 categories of damages that need to be considered by the jury. General damages, so where they have to, this is if they find in her favour, they can compensate for pain, suffering, consequences of the event, and the fact that she's not able to continue working in the career that she's in. These are all factors they need to consider. Then there are special damages, which are medical, so loss of earnings to date and loss of earnings in the future. And there were witnesses called in relation to that. Aggravated damages, then, which mark the circumstances in which the assault took place, the conduct in which the person behaved. And then the final category is punitive or exemplary damages. And he explained to the jury that this is a form of punishment by which the court expresses its disapproval by the manner in which the defendant has conducted themselves. And he said that this is your opportunity to express your disapproval of what this man did in a public forum.
And he mentions that back in 2018, when the alleged events happened, she was working as a colorist, and her employer expected that she would build up her own clientele.
Yeah, and this is going into all of the evidence to support the claim, that she ultimately should be entitled to compensation. As I say, we won't go into detail with that, and certainly the judge's charge also goes into that. Basically, ultimately now, if the jury find in favor of Miss Hand, they have to consider all of those damages. I just want to go to the very end of what Mr. Gordon said, because when he finally went through all of that, and that was a considerable period of time going through all of the previous witnesses to support that case for compensation. He said, "I suggest to you that the evidence is embarrassing and overwhelming in relation to against Conor McGregor." And he said the next step it has to be another lie. And of course, the more you build on the lies, the more patently outrageous it becomes. So you end up saying things like she took a swan dive into the bath or she got knocked about. He said none of that answers anything. All it does is underline why you should now vindicate and compensate my client. You can figure out the fact from the fiction, he said to the jury. That's your job, and I have no doubt you'll do it to the best of your ability.
And that was the end of Mr. Gordon's speech.
So Judge Alex Owens began his charge to the jury, and he told the jurors that he'll explain the various roles and what is considered assault in the context of the issues of this trial and who must prove what. He told the jury he has no function to express a view, and that the jurors' role is as judges in the facts of this case, and that they must look wholly, rationally and calmly at the evidence. He told the jury that they're being asked to decide is if Conor McGregor assaulted Nikita Hand, and equally if James Lawrence assaulted Nikita Hand. He said Nikita Hand is claiming damages for assault, for civil wrong, and she is claiming that she was assaulted by a defendant, so she is therefore entitled to damages if this is proved. He said in order to bring a verdict in favour of Miss Hand, you must be satisfied that she proved her case against the defendant. The jury must answer, does the evidence prove she was assaulted by Mr. McGregor in the penthouse suite of the Beacon? Does the evidence prove she was assaulted by Mr. Lawrence? Those are the beginning, middle and end of the case, and everything rotates around those two questions, he said. He said that Miss Hand alleged she was raped, and if they say no and say it was consensual, he said that's for them to determine. This is two separate legal actions heard together for administrative convenience, he said. And he said that Miss Hand's account that she was raped by Conor McGregor, they have to consider whether it is more likely than not to represent the objective truth. And he said that he uses the word rather than truth or lies. If not, you don't proceed further, he said. He also told the jurors that they must ask themselves, am I satisfied that this piece of evidence on the balance of probabilities established that he raped her? He said the issue starts with a clean sheet, and if the answer starts at no and the evidence moves the dial to yes. He said their job is to decide the case in accordance with the evidence, and he said it really boils down to who you believe. He said it's a matter of truth or lies. One side or the other in this case is telling lies. That is my view for what it is worth. So Mr. Justice Owens said that the actions against Conor McGregor and Mr. Lawrence are separate, and it does not follow that they need to reach the same conclusion on each question for each man. He said you answer them separately even though the evidence is common to both. The same for damages, they must be assessed separately. Some issues in relation to damages relate only to her claim against Conor McGregor, for example, the PTSD. He said, so you're not being asked to award special damages against James Lawrence. As to drunkenness, the judge said that he will say a lot about this issue. He said that people can have consensual sex while intoxicated, but it is different when someone is so intoxicated that they cannot exercise free and voluntary will, and maybe simply so out of it they don't have a clear idea as to what they are about. Mr. Justice Owens said that wearing certain clothes on Instagram is not an invitation. And of course, men might be attracted to women, but if they want to take it further, it requires consent. He said the fact that a woman engages in risky activity like drinking or taking drugs does not mean they are up for sex. And while excessive alcohol can lead to disinhibition, you can't engage in the presumption that women who engage in this behavior are promiscuous. He said that there can be a prejudice against people with mental illnesses and the reliability of their evidence, that the jury should disregard in their evidence about Ms. Hand's previous panic attacks. He said there is no room for speculation and that's not allowed. And it can conclude that excessive alcohol affects good judgment and affects memory. It can conclude to patchy and fragmented memory of the night before. He said these are all matters you have experience of and you do not require medical expertise. And so the case resumes tomorrow. I believe he's still in the midst of his charge to the jury.
So once Mr. Justice Owens finishes, it's over to the jury. But that's another day, and we'll see what happens tomorrow.
We'll see what happens tomorrow. If matters go out to the jury tomorrow, which we expect it will, they have as much time as they want to deliberate. And so we'll see if it all comes to a head tomorrow or in the coming days. In the hands of the jury. Okay. Thanks, Paul. Thanks very much for that. That was very comprehensive.